The day humanity stopped looking primitive was not the day we built the biggest starship. It was the day someone finally opened the right garage. Dawn settled over the Appalachian foothills in a wash of pale gold, painting long shadows across rusted rooftops and weathered fences while a thin veil of mist drifted lazily between towering oak trees. The morning air carried the scent of damp earth, pine needles, and warm motor oil that had soaked into the old concrete floor decades before. Hidden at the edge of a forgotten county road stood a modest corrugated steel building whose faded sign simply read Walker Garage. Its white paint had peeled under 40 years of rain and summer heat, leaving only ghostly outlines of letters that refused to disappear completely. There were no holographic advertisements, no autonomous repair drones hovering overhead, and certainly no shimmering force fields guarding priceless technology. A weathered red pickup rested beside the entrance with its hood raised, while shelves overflowing with wrenches, bearings, pistons, carburetors, and hand-polished tools filled every visible corner inside. Each tool had its place. Every scratch carried a memory. Every stain had earned the right to remain. Ethan Walker tightened the final bolt on an aging V8 engine before wiping grease from his hands with a faded shop towel. At 35 years old, he had inherited more than just the family business. He had inherited patience. His broad shoulders and practical strength came from decades of lifting engines instead of weights, and the tiny scars scattered across his knuckles quietly recorded every lesson his father and grandfather had taught him. He never rushed a repair because machines, much like people, revealed their secrets only to those willing to listen. He leaned closer as the engine idled roughly, closed his eyes, and listened. Tick, hum, soft vibration, one uneven pulse every 6 rotations. A faint smile crossed his face before he reached for a socket wrench without looking. He already knew exactly which bearing had begun wearing unevenly. Hundreds of miles above Earth, a vessel unlike anything ever imagined by human engineers emerged. From Silent Warp, its silver hull reflected the morning sunlight with almost liquid elegance as thousands of microscopic panels shifted continuously to balance heat, gravity, and atmospheric pressure. The ship belonged to the Galactic Engineering Council, and aboard stood the woman whose reputation stretched across nearly every civilized world. Cerelia, celebrated as the greatest mechanic in the known galaxy, watched the blue planet through a transparent observation wall. Her luminous ivory complexion caught the soft starlight with an almost pearlescent glow, while strands of silver-white hair rested neatly against the high collar of her tailored engineering uniform. Her large amber eyes contained intricate crystalline rings that shimmered subtly whenever she focused on something unfamiliar. Everything about her reflected refinement born from centuries of technological advancement rather than ornament. She folded her hands behind her back as the ship's artificial intelligence displayed Earth's industrial profile. Factories, research laboratories, aerospace facilities. Then one insignificant location blinked onto the projection. Walker Garage, rural Pennsylvania. Population nearby, under 3,000. Technological rating, obsolete. Estimated equipment age, 32 to 81 Earth years. Another line appeared beneath the first, highlighted in gold rather than white. Historical maintenance anomaly. 17 independent engineering cases classified as statistically improbable. For incidents where human mechanical solutions outperformed galactic predictive models despite having no access to advanced technology. Recommendation: direct field verification required. The bridge grew unexpectedly quiet. One council member broke the silence. Those records have been reviewed 3 times. The artificial intelligence still cannot explain them. Another added, every analysis reaches the same conclusion. Either the data is corrupted, or one human mechanic continues producing results that should not be possible. Cerelia studied the report for several thoughtful seconds before a quiet laugh escaped her lips. They requested that I evaluate humanity's finest. Mechanical talent, she said calmly. Surely this cannot be the place. Although her words carried gentle disbelief, she authorized the landing without another question. If the reports were wrong, the council would finally close one of the oldest unresolved anomalies in its engineering archives. If they were right, then somewhere inside an aging garage on a forgotten country road, someone had preserved a way of understanding machines that an entire galaxy might have left behind. Several council members exchanged curious glances as the shuttle descended toward the quiet valley below. None of them noticed the old mechanic inside the tiny garage gently resting one hand against a humming engine, smiling as though the machine itself had just whispered something only he could understand. The shuttle touched the cracked asphalt with barely a whisper, yet every loose bolt hanging on the garage wall answered with a faint metallic chime. Ethan looked up from the open engine bay, not because the sound was loud, but because it was unfamiliar. He had spent his entire life recognizing the language of machines, and this one sounded unlike anything he had ever heard. Instead of roaring turbines or vibrating compressors, it hummed with an almost musical rhythm that seemed too perfectly balanced to belong to ordinary engineering. Dust drifted across the parking lot as the sleek silver craft settled only 30 yards from the garage entrance. Its seamless surface reflected the surrounding pine trees as though the forest itself had become part of its polished skin. No landing gear unfolded. No exhaust disturbed the morning air. It simply rested there, as if gravity had politely agreed to hold it in place. Ethan quietly laid his wrench on the workbench before walking outside, wiping his hands on the same faded towel he had carried all morning. The old bell hanging above the garage door rang softly behind him. 3 elegant figures stepped down from the shuttle. They wore tailored uniforms woven from shimmering fabric that seemed to change texture whenever sunlight struck it from a different angle. Between them walked Cerelia, her posture perfectly composed, her luminous ivory complexion glowing beneath the clear Pennsylvania sky. She studied the building without speaking. Her amber eyes moved slowly from the rust along the roofline to the worn concrete driveway, then to the faded sign above the entrance. Every detail reinforced the conclusion she had already reached during the descent. This place belonged in a museum, not in an engineering report. Ethan offered a small nod. "Morning. Can I help you?" His voice carried the calm confidence of someone who had never needed to impress anyone. One council representative stepped forward and activated a floating translator. "Citizen Ethan Walker. By authorization of the Galactic Engineering Council, Chief Engineer Cerelia has accepted Earth's invitation to inspect its finest mechanical craftsmanship." Ethan blinked once before looking around the empty road. "I think somebody made a wrong turn." A faint smile appeared on one council member's face, but Cerelia remained completely serious. Her gaze settled on the weathered pickup truck parked beside the building. She slowly walked toward it, examining the exposed engine compartment. The cast iron block showed decades of careful maintenance. Replacement parts from different manufacturers fit together with surprising precision. Every hose had been trimmed by hand. Every fastener aligned perfectly despite the vehicle's age. "How old is this machine?" she asked. 48 years, Ethan answered. "Still earns its keep." Cerelia raised one elegant eyebrow. "You continue repairing obsolete combustion engines? If somebody depends on it to get home, it is not obsolete." His answer arrived so naturally that it almost sounded obvious. She looked toward the open garage. Rows of manual tools lined the walls beside mechanical presses, drill presses, welding equipment, and wooden cabinets whose polished handles had been touched by generations of hard-working hands. There were no robotic assistants, no automated diagnostic chambers, no quantum fabrication units. She quietly laughed again, softer than before. "Your civilization crossed interstellar space," she said. "Yet your greatest mechanic works without artificial intelligence." Ethan shrugged. "Never had one. Surely that limits your capability." He smiled politely. "Depends on what you think capability means." Before Cerelia could respond, an elderly rancher drove into the lot in a faded blue tractor that sputtered unevenly before stopping beside the garage. The old man climbed down, tipped his hat toward Ethan, and said, "Morning, son." She started making that funny knocking sound again. Ethan did not open a scanner. He did not connect a computer. He simply rested one grease-stained hand against the side of the engine, closed his eyes for 3 quiet seconds, and listened. The entire council watched in respectful silence as the old garage became so still that even the distant song of meadow birds seemed to fade beneath the gentle heartbeat of a machine, waiting for someone who truly understood its voice. Ethan opened his eyes and reached beneath the hood without hesitation. His fingers stopped on a single mounting bracket before giving it the slightest push. The knocking disappeared for one heartbeat, then quietly returned. He smiled as though greeting an old friend. "The front harmonic balancer is beginning to separate from the rubber isolator," he said. "It still has another few hundred miles left, but I would not pull a heavy trailer until I replace it." The elderly rancher stared at him. "You figured that out without taking anything apart?" Ethan shrugged. "It was already telling us." Cerelia glanced toward one of her assistants. The alien immediately activated a compact diagnostic sphere that floated over the tractor. Thin beams of pale blue light swept across every moving component while countless symbols flowed through the holographic display. Less than 3 seconds later, the artificial intelligence produced its conclusion. Harmonic balancer degradation detected. Structural failure probability within 482 miles. Confidence level, 99.96%. A brief silence settled across the parking lot. The council members exchanged restrained looks, while Cerelia slowly lowered the floating display. She had expected the human to arrive at the correct answer eventually. She had not expected him to reach it before a machine capable of analyzing billions of variables each second. Ethan simply reached for his toolbox. Should not take long. He wheeled an old metal cart beside the tractor. Every drawer opened with the familiar scrape of steel worn smooth by decades of use. Wrenches showed polished edges from countless repairs. Screwdrivers carried initials engraved by his grandfather. Even the wooden handle of an old hammer had become darker where generations of hands had gripped it. Cerelia watched him select each tool without searching. There was no hesitation, no wasted movement. Every action carried the quiet efficiency of habit shaped over an entire lifetime. She stepped closer. "Your equipment is extraordinarily primitive." Ethan loosened the first bolt before smiling. "It still fits. Our engineering systems manufacture replacement components at the molecular level within seconds." "That sounds impressive." "It is." Ethan nodded politely. "But somebody still has to know which part needs replacing." Her crystalline eyes narrowed slightly. She had heard confidence before, pride before, arrogance before. What stood before her felt different. It carried no desire to compete, no need to prove superiority, only quiet certainty earned through experience. While Ethan worked, one council engineer wandered deeper into the garage. Moments later, his footsteps stopped completely. "Chief Engineer," he called softly. "You should see this." Cerelia followed him through the open doorway. Her eyes slowly widened. The interior stretched farther than she had expected, every wall covered from floor to ceiling with shelves of meticulously organized components. Antique piston engines rested beside early jet turbines. Steam valves shared space with electric motors. Mechanical clocks ticked steadily beside aircraft fuel pumps. There were handwritten notebooks stacked neatly across wooden shelves, each labeled by year. Thousands of pages filled with sketches, measurements, repair notes, observations, and tiny diagrams drawn in careful pencil. No digital backups. No cloud archives. Just paper worn smooth from years of use. Cerelia gently opened one notebook. Every repair included not only technical specifications, but personal observations. "Engine sounds nervous during cold mornings." Customer smiled after hearing it idle again. "Never ignore a vibration that disappears when warmed." She blinked. Machines described almost like living companions. Another notebook contained notes written nearly 60 years earlier in different handwriting. Then another even older. 3 generations. One continuous conversation with every machine that had ever entered the building. Outside, Ethan tightened the final bolt before starting the tractor. The engine settled into a smooth, even rhythm that blended naturally with the whispering breeze moving through the nearby pines. The elderly rancher grinned, tipped his hat again, and drove away smiling. Cerelia remained standing inside the quiet garage, one weathered notebook still resting gently in her hands, while a thought she had never considered before slowly took shape. Perhaps humanity's greatest invention had never been a machine at all. Perhaps it was the patience to truly understand one. Iron filings drifted through narrow beams of sunlight as Ethan carefully returned every wrench to its place before wiping the workbench clean with a faded cotton rag. Nothing inside the garage felt hurried. Even silence seemed to have its own rhythm. Cerelia slowly closed the weathered notebook and traced its worn leather cover with one slender finger. The edges had softened from decades of use, yet every page remained perfectly ordered. She had visited engineering archives larger than entire cities, but none of them carried the quiet intimacy resting inside this small building. Every handwritten note reflected a conversation between one human and one machine, repeated thousands of times across 3 generations. One council engineer broke the silence as his wrist communicator suddenly emitted a sharp crystalline tone. His composed expression disappeared almost instantly. "Chief Engineer," he said, looking toward Cerelia. "Priority transmission from the orbital command vessel." She accepted the holographic projection. A rotating image of an advanced graviton propulsion core appeared above her palm. Several sections flashed amber while streams of diagnostic data flowed too quickly for any human eye to follow. "Status?" Cerelia asked. "A resonance imbalance developed during atmospheric stabilization," another engineer answered through the transmission. "The propulsion core remains operational, but the harmonic field cannot synchronize beyond 87%. Artificial intelligence has completed 1,300 simulations without identifying the source." Cerelia's calm expression remained unchanged, although a faint crease appeared between her brows. "Dispatch auxiliary fabrication drones." "Already attempted." "Replace the phase regulators." "No improvement." "Run complete quantum recalibration." "Completed 4 times." Silence followed. Ethan quietly continued organizing sockets into their drawer before asking, without looking up, "Something giving you trouble?" One council member offered a polite smile that carried unmistakable amusement. "This propulsion system represents engineering beyond anything developed on Earth." Ethan nodded. "Still sounds like it is broken." Cerelia looked toward him. "The propulsion core contains over 900 trillion active components operating simultaneously. It cannot be understood through mechanical intuition." Ethan leaned against the workbench. "Maybe not, but every machine is trying to do one thing. If it stops doing that, something changed." She studied him for several seconds. "You believe the principle is universal? Does not matter if it is a lawn mower or a spaceship. Machines do not wake up one morning and decide to misbehave. They react." One engineer quietly laughed. "Respectfully, your experience repairing automobiles does not prepare you to diagnose galactic propulsion technology." Ethan smiled without taking offense. "Probably not." He picked up a yellow carpenter's pencil and a scrap of brown packing paper lying beside an old vise. "But maybe I can ask a few simple questions." Cerelia hesitated before enlarging the holographic image above the workbench. Ethan stepped closer. Brilliant blue energy pathways rotated through transparent layers while mathematical symbols surrounded every component. He ignored almost all of it. Instead, he watched the central assembly complete 3 full cycles. Then 4. Then 5. His eyes narrowed slightly. "Can you stop it?" One engineer blinked. "Stop the simulation?" "No. Freeze it halfway through one complete rotation." The hologram paused. Ethan circled slowly around the projection, hands resting behind his back. He was not trying to understand alien mathematics. He was watching relationships. Bearings aligned with shafts. Rotating masses balanced against each other. Energy entered one side and exited another. Finally, he pointed toward a small stabilizing ring. "What is that piece supposed to do?" "Dynamic harmonic compensator," Cerelia answered. "It automatically adjusts microscopic resonance drift." Ethan nodded slowly. "Then why is every other part waiting for it?" Several council engineers immediately looked back toward the projection. Nobody answered. Ethan reached for the pencil and quietly drew 2 circles connected by a simple line on the brown paper. "Sometimes," he said softly, "the smartest part in the whole machine forgets that it is supposed to follow the engine instead of leading it." The garage grew unusually quiet. Even the old wall clock seemed louder as its steady ticking echoed between shelves lined with steel, brass, and wood. Every member of the Galactic Engineering Council stood motionless around the hovering projection while Ethan's simple sketch rested on the workbench beneath it. 2 circles, 1 connecting line. Nothing more complicated than what a high school student might draw. Yet nobody reached to erase it. Cerelia looked from the brown paper to the hologram suspended above it. Her crystalline eyes followed the rotating compensator once again, this time not as the galaxy's most celebrated engineer, but as someone willing to question an assumption she had never challenged before. "Expand the compensator control architecture," she instructed. The The projection unfolded into dozens of nested systems connected by luminous streams of energy. One council engineer immediately shook his head. Chief engineer, the artificial intelligence already verified every synchronization pathway. I know, she answered. Calmly. Expand it anyway. Thousands of additional data points appeared. Ethan ignored almost all of them. Instead, he watched the rhythm. Every few seconds, the central assembly hesitated ever so slightly before correcting itself. It was subtle enough that even the engineers had accepted it as normal. Ethan leaned closer. There. One engineer frowned. There where? Ethan pointed toward the brief hesitation. That little pause. The delay measures less than 1/1,000,000th of a second, another engineer replied. It falls well within acceptable tolerances. Ethan smiled gently. Maybe for the computer. Nobody spoke. He reached toward an old cast iron flywheel hanging from the garage wall. It had belonged to his grandfather's first tractor and now served no purpose except reminding Ethan where everything had started. He gave it a slow spin with one finger. The heavy wheel rotated smoothly before gradually settling to a stop. See that? He asked. Several council members looked uncertainly at the ancient piece of machinery. Momentum, Ethan continued. Every moving system wants balance. If something keeps correcting itself before it needs correcting, eventually it creates the very problem it is trying to prevent. Cerelia turned back toward the projection. Reduce compensator authority by 5%, she ordered. Chief engineer, one assistant objected carefully. That would violate standard optimization protocols. Do it. The adjustment completed instantly. The resonance graph shifted upward only slightly before stabilizing. 87% became 91. Quiet surprise spread across the group. Ethan folded his arms, but said nothing. Reduce another 5%, Cerelia said. The graph climbed again. 94%. One engineer stared at the display in disbelief. Impossible. Ethan chuckled softly. Machines like confidence. They do not like being second-guessed every millisecond. Cerelia slowly approached the workbench where the old paper sketch still lay beside a grease-stained wrench. You did not calculate quantum resonance, she said. No. You do not understand graviton harmonics. Not a bit. Then how? Ethan rested both hands on the scarred wooden bench. Because every mechanic eventually learns the same lesson. The more you fight a good machine, the less it trusts you. Sometimes fixing something means stepping back and letting it do the job it was built to do. Those words settled over the garage with unexpected weight. The council members looked around the room once more. They noticed things they had ignored earlier. The polished handles worn smooth by decades of use. The shelves arranged not by algorithm, but by memory. The handwritten notebooks filled with observations no sensor would ever record. Outside, the afternoon breeze carried the scent of fresh-cut grass through the open doorway, while sunlight reflected from the silver hull of the council shuttle. Cerelia quietly picked up the carpenter's pencil Ethan had used only moments before. She turned it thoughtfully between her fingers, studying the tiny bite marks near one end and the faded lettering almost rubbed away by years of work. It was the simplest tool in the entire building. Yet somehow, on this ordinary afternoon in a forgotten human garage, it had accomplished something that the finest technology in the galaxy had failed to do. For the first time since arriving on Earth, Cerelia realized she was no longer conducting an inspection. She had become a student. Ironically, the most advanced visitors in the galaxy spent the rest of the afternoon doing something none of them had expected. They stopped talking and started watching. Ethan returned the carpenter's pencil to its place inside a chipped ceramic mug, folded the brown paper sketch, and slipped it between 2 pages of an old service manual as though it were nothing special. Outside, clouds drifted lazily across the Pennsylvania sky while a gentle breeze carried the scent of fresh hay from neighboring fields. The garage settled back into its ordinary rhythm. A delivery van arrived with worn brake pads. A schoolteacher stopped by to ask about a stubborn air conditioner in her aging sedan. A young couple pulled in because a dashboard warning light had appeared during a weekend trip. Ethan greeted each customer by name. He listened more than he spoke. He never hurried anyone. Cerelia quietly followed him from one repair to the next, saying very little. She noticed something no engineering database had ever recorded. Every customer described the problem differently. One said the steering wheel felt nervous. Another claimed the engine sounded tired. A third insisted the truck simply did not feel happy anymore. None of those descriptions were technically precise, yet Ethan never corrected them. Instead, he translated emotion into mechanics with effortless patience. "It starts a little rough after rain?" he asked one customer. "Exactly," she replied with relief. "That is exactly what I meant." He smiled. "Let us have a look." Cerelia watched him inspect the ignition system with nothing more than a flashlight, a mirror, and years of experience. A tiny crack in one ignition coil allowed moisture to interfere with the spark. 5 minutes later, the engine started smoothly. The grateful driver left smiling, convinced Ethan had performed something close to magic. "You never laughed at the way she described the problem," Cerelia observed after the car disappeared down the road. Ethan closed the hood gently. "People are not mechanics. They tell me what they feel. It is my job to figure out what the machine is trying to say." The words lingered in Cerelia's mind. Her civilization had spent centuries teaching engineers to interpret numbers with absolute precision. Humanity, she realized, had quietly learned to interpret people first. As afternoon sunlight stretched across the concrete floor, Ethan walked toward a tall wooden cabinet tucked into the far corner of the garage. He opened it carefully. Inside rested dozens of polished wooden boxes, each carrying a handwritten family name. Cerelia looked inside one of them. Every box contained small mechanical parts that had long since become obsolete. Carburetor jets, brass bushings, hand machine washers, custom springs, tiny gears wrapped individually in soft cloth. "Why keep all of these?" she asked. "Nobody manufactures these anymore." Ethan lifted one weathered gear between his fingers. "Exactly," he smiled. "Some families have been bringing their vehicles here for 3 generations. When a part disappears forever, somebody still has to remember how to make another one." Cerelia studied the old gear. "Your civilization preserves discontinued technology by preserving people." "Mostly stories," Ethan answered. "Stories remember things computers stop caring about." Before she could respond, a quiet alert sounded from the shuttle parked outside. One council engineer hurried inside, carrying a compact projection unit. "Chief Engineer," he said, "Orbital Command reports the propulsion resonance continues improving after your adjustments. Efficiency has reached 98.4%. A ripple of quiet surprise moved through the council. Nobody celebrated. Nobody applauded. Instead, every eye turned naturally toward Ethan. He did not even look up from the bench where he was carefully shaping a small brass spacer on an old manual lathe. Fine golden shavings curled gently onto the tray below, while the steady hum of the machine blended with birds singing beyond the open garage door. Cerelia watched the simple lathe spinning beneath practiced hands and slowly understood something no academy had ever taught her. Technology could multiply knowledge, accelerate production, and solve unimaginable equations, but it could never replace the quiet discipline required to earn wisdom one repair, one mistake, and one patient conversation at a time. The first stars appeared long before anyone inside the garage noticed that the day had quietly slipped into evening. Warm amber lights hanging from the ceiling reflected across polished chrome, old glass jars filled with carefully sorted bolts, and shelves that carried nearly a century of accumulated knowledge. Outside, the Galactic Council shuttle rested silently beneath a sky that looked almost unfamiliar after years spent traveling between worlds where artificial atmospheres softened every sunset into mathematical perfection. Earth did not seem interested in perfection. Its colors changed unpredictably. Its wind shifted without warning. Its machines aged. Its people adapted. Ethan switched on an old coffee maker that rattled louder than it brewed. The rich aroma slowly filled the garage, blending naturally with the scent of motor oil and fresh-cut pine drifting through the open door. He placed 2 plain ceramic mugs on the workbench before pouring the coffee, without asking whether Cerelia wanted any. She accepted the mug after watching the rising steam for several quiet seconds. "Your people drink this every day?" she asked. Ethan smiled. "Some days it fixes the mechanic before the machine." A faint smile finally appeared across her face. It was the first genuine expression the council members had seen since arriving on Earth. She took one careful sip before setting the mug back onto the scarred wooden bench. "It is surprisingly effective." Ethan laughed softly. "That is usually how it starts." Before either of them spoke again, the silence was interrupted by a sharp alert from the shuttle outside. This time the sound carried an urgency none of the engineers had heard before. One council officer hurried into the garage, breathing faster than before. "Chief Engineer, we have an unexpected situation. One of the orbital support vessels has lost synchronization with its emergency docking array after the propulsion adjustment. The ship remains stable, but the mechanical locking assembly refuses to engage." Cerelia accepted the transmission immediately. A rotating hologram of the docking mechanism appeared above the workbench. Unlike the propulsion system, this assembly relied upon dozens of precisely timed mechanical actuators working together before the magnetic field activated. Every indicator appeared green. Every diagnostic reported full functionality. Yet the locking arms remained frozen only inches from their final position. "Artificial intelligence reports no faults," one engineer explained. "Every component passes inspection." Ethan quietly looked at the projection while finishing his coffee. "Then why is it not working?" The engineer hesitated. "We do not know." Ethan stepped closer. "Can you play it again?" The animation repeated. Tiny arms extended. Rotors aligned. Magnetic rings accelerated. Then everything stopped just before completion. Ethan watched 3 more times without speaking. Finally, he asked a question so simple that several council members looked confused. "What happens if the last arm closes first?" The engineers exchanged puzzled glances. "That sequence violates standard assembly logic," one replied. "Because?" Ethan asked. "Because it always has." He nodded thoughtfully. "That is not an answer." Cerelia looked carefully at the animation once more. She slowed the final seconds until every movement became visible. Suddenly, she noticed something she had overlooked hundreds of times during previous inspections. Every actuator waited for confirmation from another actuator before completing its own motion. Every component trusted the computer more than the mechanism beside it. She looked toward Ethan. "They are waiting for permission instead of working together." Ethan smiled. "Sounds like a traffic jam." One engineer quickly modified the simulation, allowing the final locking arm to move independently by less than half an inch before requesting system confirmation. The result appeared almost instantly. Every remaining actuator completed its movement naturally. The docking assembly locked perfectly. Complete synchronization achieved. 100% stability confirmed. Nobody spoke for several long moments. Outside, crickets began singing across the quiet valley while the old coffee maker released one final tired hiss. Cerelia slowly looked around the modest garage once again. The worn benches, the hand tools, the notebooks, the quiet mechanic, and the ordinary evening suddenly carried a significance she could no longer measure with titles, rankings, or technology. Somewhere during this unforgettable day, the smallest workshop she had ever visited had quietly become the most important classroom in the galaxy. By the time midnight settled over the valley, the council had canceled its departure without a single objection. The shuttle remained parked beside the garage, its silver hull reflecting the pale moonlight, while distant frogs and crickets filled the countryside with a rhythm no artificial sound system could reproduce. Inside the garage, only a handful of lights remained on. Ethan sat at the old wooden desk near the back wall, carefully updating a service record. With a sharpened pencil, every completed repair received a date, the customer's name, the parts replaced, and one final observation written in plain language. Started smoother after warming. Owner smiled before leaving. Check belt again next winter. Cerelia stood quietly behind him, reading over his shoulder without interrupting. "You still write everything by hand," she said softly. Ethan nodded. "Writing makes me slow down." "Your computer could store infinitely more information." "Probably." He smiled without looking up. "But it cannot remember what mattered to me when I fixed it." Those words stayed with her as she slowly walked through the garage one final time. Every shelf now seemed different from when she had first entered. Earlier, she had seen outdated tools. Now she saw continuity. She had seen obsolete engines. Now she saw generations of solutions. She had seen a small family business. Now she saw a living archive that no database had ever managed to replace. One council engineer approached carrying a fresh transmission from orbit. His expression reflected something between excitement and disbelief. "Chief Engineer, the council has completed a historical review." Cerelia accepted the report. "Proceed." After comparing maintenance records from 281 member civilizations, we discovered a consistent trend. As automation increased across the galaxy, manual diagnostic training gradually disappeared. Apprentices learned software before mechanics. Artificial intelligence became the first technician instead of the final tool. Within 4 centuries, nearly every civilization stopped teaching engineers how to understand machines without automated assistance. A long silence followed. Ethan looked up from his notebook but said nothing. The engineer continued. Earth appears to be the only known civilization where independent mechanical craftsmanship remains common at every level, from local workshops to advanced aerospace engineering. Cerelia slowly lowered the projection. Suddenly, countless moments from the day connected together inside her mind. Ethan listening before measuring. Customers describing feelings instead of error codes. Families preserving parts no factory manufactured anymore. Notebooks filled with observations no algorithm would ever think to record. Humanity had not remained behind the rest of the galaxy. Humanity had simply refused to abandon one skill everyone else believed had become unnecessary. She turned toward Ethan. Do you know why your method survived when ours disappeared? Ethan rested the pencil across the open notebook before thinking for a moment. Maybe because things break differently out here. She smiled gently. No, that is not the reason. He looked at her with quiet curiosity. She stepped closer to the old workbench where the brown paper sketch still rested inside the service manual. My people believed intelligence meant building machines that no longer needed us. Her crystalline eyes reflected the warm workshop lights. Your people kept building mechanics who never stopped needing to learn. The distinction settled over the room with surprising weight. Outside, a gentle wind moved through the pine trees, carrying the scent of cool earth beneath the stars. One council member quietly removed the polished insignia identifying him as a senior systems architect and placed it on the workbench beside the worn carpenter's pencil. Another engineer did the same. One by one, without being asked, every member of the delegation removed the symbols of rank they had worn with pride for decades. None of them spoke. None of them needed to. Cerelia looked at the simple collection of polished emblems resting beside grease-stained tools and smiled with quiet humility. The most valuable lesson in the galaxy had not been hidden inside an ancient engine or a forgotten notebook. It had been waiting inside the hands of an ordinary man who never believed wisdom became outdated simply because technology became faster. Morning arrived with a quiet confidence that felt different from every other sunrise Ethan had known. Golden light spilled through the garage windows, illuminating floating dust that danced above scarred workbenches and polished hand tools. Outside, the Silver Council shuttle no longer looked like an impossible visitor from another civilization. Parked beside an old red pickup beneath towering oak trees, it simply looked like another machine waiting for someone to understand it. Ethan unlocked the front door, and the familiar bell announced another ordinary day. Before he could reach the workbench, Cerelia stepped forward carrying a small crystal case in both hands. Every council member stood silently behind her. Gone were the polished insignias of rank. Gone were the expressions of quiet superiority that had accompanied their arrival. She opened the case. Inside rested the highest engineering emblem awarded by the Galactic Engineering Council, a symbol carried by only one living mechanic at any given time. The polished surface reflected the warm morning light before she gently placed it on the scarred wooden bench beside Ethan's grandfather's old wrench. "This belongs to you," she said. Ethan looked at the emblem, then slowly shook his head. "No, ma'am, it does not." Several council members exchanged confused glances. Cerelia remained still. "You solved problems that none of us could solve." Ethan smiled kindly. "I helped with 2 machines. That does not make me the greatest mechanic in the galaxy." He gently slid the emblem back toward her. "Titles fix pride. Work fixes machines." The simple sentence settled over everyone present. For the first time in her distinguished career, Cerelia realized the greatest lesson she had learned on Earth had nothing to do with engineering. True mastery never introduced itself. It simply went back to work. She closed the crystal case without disappointment. Instead, she reached into another compartment and removed a thin metallic plaque no larger than a notebook. "Then perhaps this belongs here instead." Together they walked outside to the weathered sign above the garage entrance. The faded letters still read Walker Garage, worn by decades of rain, snow, and summer heat. Cerelia carefully attached the new plaque beneath it. The engraved words shimmered softly in both English and the common language of the Galactic Council. Human Craftsmanship Preservation Site. First Interstellar Apprenticeship Workshop. Ethan blinked. Apprenticeship. Cerelia nodded. Not because of what happened yesterday. She looked toward the old garage before continuing. Because the council spent the entire night reviewing 4 centuries of engineering records from every member civilization. We discovered that the reports were true. We stopped teaching mechanics to understand machines. We only taught them how to command artificial intelligence. She smiled gently. This garage preserved something the galaxy believed it no longer needed. Ethan looked across the quiet valley as a gentle breeze carried the scent of pine and fresh-cut grass through the morning air. He rubbed the back of his neck and laughed softly. This little place is going to get crowded. Yes, Cerelia replied with a warm smile. That is the point. Weeks later, the narrow country road looked unlike anything the local town had ever witnessed. Instead of traffic jams filled with ordinary cars, elegant starships rested peacefully along the roadside, while engineers from worlds separated by thousands of light years waited patiently outside a modest steel building with faded paint and squeaking hinges. Inside, Ethan explained the difference between hearing a bearing fail and merely detecting it. Young engineers filled handwritten notebooks instead of relying entirely on digital archives. The old carpenter's pencil continued growing shorter with every lesson, while fresh pages carried ideas that would travel farther than any machine inside the garage ever could. High above Earth, engineering academies across the galaxy quietly changed their first lesson. Before students learned equations, they learned to listen. Before they trusted the computer, they learned to trust the machine. And every official manual began with a sentence credited not to the greatest engineer in history, but to an ordinary mechanic from Pennsylvania. If you want a machine to tell you what is wrong, be patient enough to hear what it has been trying to say. As the final shuttle prepared to leave, Cerelia paused beside the weathered garage door where she had first stood with quiet amusement only days before. Her eyes drifted across the old workbench, the shelves of worn tools, the handwritten notebooks, and finally to Ethan as he tightened another bolt on an aging engine without noticing she was watching. A gentle smile touched her face. When I first arrived, she said softly, I believed the greatest thing inside this garage would be a machine unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. She shook her head almost imperceptibly. I was wrong. Ethan looked up with quiet curiosity. Cerelia met his eyes. The greatest thing inside this garage was never the machines. It was the human who never stopped listening to them. Neither of them spoke again. There was nothing left to prove. As evening settled across the Pennsylvania hills once more, Ethan closed the shop door, switched off the lights, and walked toward home beneath a sky now crossed by quiet stars and distant visiting ships. The sign above the entrance still looked old. The building still looked small. But in the fading light, one simple human garage had become the place where an entire galaxy finally remembered that the strongest technology it had ever lost was not a machine. It was the human being willing to understand one. The story ends here, but perhaps its quietest lesson is only just beginning. Some machines are repaired with better parts. Others are repaired by the people willing to truly understand them. Maybe that has always been humanity's quiet strength. If you stood where Cerelia once stood, what do you think you would have seen inside that humble garage? Share your thoughts in the comments. If stories like this remind you why humanity still matters among the stars, consider subscribing and turning on notifications so you will not miss the next journey. Thank you for spending this time with us. Until our paths cross again, may every distant star still leave room for a human heart.